All right, it's the first session of the day, which centers around how we can have productive conversations using the art of debate to share perspectives and find new ways of collaborating. Our moderator for today's session is Rudyard Griffiths of the Monk Debates, a well-known public debating forum. Now, as a public commentator on Canadian cultural issues, as well as national and international affairs, Rudyard is an expert in understanding the intricacies of international politics and history. But his accomplishments don't end there. Not only has he been featured on Bloomberg TV, the Globe and Mail, as well as a co-anchor for the national affairs on CTV News, his book, Who We Are, a Citizen's Manifesto, won the Globe and Mail's Best Book of the Year award. Named one of Canada's top 40 under 40, please join me in welcoming Rudyard Griffiths.
Hey, thank you, Tyrone. Great to be with you here at Think 2030. And I want to salute the organizers for putting together some really meaningful debates that we're going to have today and tomorrow. Debating is a great way to break out of the usual one-on-one conversation, where too often, frankly, we get other people's opinions fed to us without being able to make up our own minds. So today and tomorrow, we're going to have meaningful conversations for you in a debate format, pro versus con. You're going to have the ability to listen to those different arguments and then make up your own mind about where you stand. That is the power and promise of debate. And I want to say to everybody today that we're going to engage in these debates with civility and substance, okay? And sometimes things are going to be said that may cause your blood pressure to rise. That's all right. What I want you to try to do is keep your mind open to those opposing arguments. It's not that you're going to agree to that argument or that it's going to become what you believe, but it's about all of us at this extraordinary moment that our society and our culture is going through. It's about all of us expanding our minds, listening to the other side, formulating our own opinions, and hopefully all coming together with a better understanding of these critical issues that are shaping our society. Today we have a fabulous issue for you to debate, effectively defunding the police. Is that something that we should be doing here in Toronto as a society in Canada? We've got two fabulous debaters set up, ready to go head to head right now. Join me center stage in moments as I introduce them both. So here we are, center stage at Think 2030 with my two debate participants. I'm going to start with our virtual participant first. Many of us know him well as a former mayor of Toronto, the author of 12 books, a member of the Order of Canada. His most recent book, pertinent to our conversation today, it's called Crisis in Canada's Policing: Why Change is So Hard and How We Can Get Real Reform in Our Police Forces. Please, let's welcome John Sewell to our conversation. John, great to have you in dialogue with us today.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here.
Great. You're coming through loud and clear, and I love the way we can take advantage of a hybrid scenario here to bring participants in virtually, but also have people here in studio with us. Speaking with us today is Stephen Somerville. Stephen has had a storied 25-year career in the Toronto Police Services. As an officer, as a detective, he's gone on to form his own important company here in Canada, Stay Safe Instructional Programs, where he works with clients really from coast to coast, helping with issues around security, training, de-escalation, lots of important work that Steve is doing there. He's also a regular person for the criminal justice and court system, providing evidence and interpreting important and sometimes controversial cases that appear in our criminal justice system. He's got a whole series of accolades over the course of that quarter-century career in policing. And Stephen, I want to thank you for coming here to Think 2030 to be part of this debate.
Thank you, and good morning.
Now, we are, guys, going to do this in such a way that we're going to have a bit of a feeling of debate, but we're not going to turn this into the Oxford Union, okay? No reason to do that. I want to kind of incorporate the elements of a conversation, but also a nod to a bit of structure here to help our audience and help me understand your different and opposing ideas. First, our resolution today that both our participants have agreed on. I want to read that to the audience so that we're clear as to what our debate proposition is. That motion is, be it resolved, the reallocation of funding from police to community services is a crucial step towards equality. So just unpack that. We're talking about reallocating, moving funding from the police services to community-based services, and we're arguing in the terms of the resolution that that is a crucial step towards promoting equality and inclusion. We obviously have Stephen speaking against the motion and John in favor. So what I'm going to do, John, is I'm going to ask you to give us 2-3 minutes of opening remarks, setting out the key points of your argument in favor of the motion. Then I'll give Stephen the same opportunity for an opening statement, and then we'll move through this debate together. So, Mr. Sewell, we're passing the baton here over to you to kick off this debate.
Thank you very much. The most frequent interaction between the police and members of the public is what's called street checks or carding, where in fact the police stop someone who's not involved in any criminal activity in any kind and ask questions. Why are you here? Where are you going? What's in your backpack? And so forth. It's very intimidating. It's very frightening for those who are in fact stopped. And in fact, what's interesting about street checks or carding is that if you're Black or Indigenous, you're 4 to 5 times more likely to be stopped by police and questioned in that way than if you're white. It's clear discrimination on the basis of race. It goes further. Blacks and Indigenous persons are 4 to 5 times more likely in Canada to be subject to police violence. And in fact, those figures are higher for Indigenous people in Western Canada. And it goes further. If you look at something called discretionary charges, where in fact police have an opportunity of either looking the other way or giving a warning rather than laying a charge. And those charges would be in regard to things like minor traffic violations or shouting and making loud noises or swearing at police. In discretionary charges, again, Blacks and Indigenous persons are 4 to 5 times more likely to be charged than whites. So I think you can say that the evidence is clear, and it seems to be true across Canada in all large police forces, that racial discrimination by police in Canada is systemic. And I think to reduce that discrimination, we need to reduce those police interactions. And let's just take a look at those interactions. To use an example from Toronto, which I think is replicated throughout Canadian police forces. In the first 4 months of Toronto of this year, police responded to 300,000 calls for service. Of those calls for service, 10,000 involved violence of some sort. So it meant that 97% of the calls for service to the Toronto police did not involve sending someone who had a gun or a taser or handcuffs or a billy club or body armor. Those 97% of calls could be responded by civilians who are expert in the issues involved. As an example, trained mental health workers could be called to calls where, in fact, people are involved in a mental crisis, rather than sending the police who, as we've seen in too many cases, have ended up killing the person they were trying to protect. We could send youth workers to cases involving youth, and that involves a lot of the police activity. And we could send homelessness workers to those involving homeless, and those who know about drug addiction issues to those involved in drug addiction. So defunding or detasking, I think detasking is a better word, detasking police of most of these calls they respond to will provide better service, less cost, and they'll reduce racial discrimination. So I think it's really clear that reallocation of funding from police to community services is a crucial step towards equality in our society.
Thank you, John. Focused to the point, I appreciate that. Our motion today that we're debating is, be it resolved, the reallocation of funding from police to community services is a crucial step towards equality. Stephen, you're arguing against the motion. Let's give you the same opportunity to give us a few introductory remarks. Don't feel you have to make all your points. We're going to be able to explore this debate over the next 40 minutes together fully, but what are your top line arguments here that you'd like to put on the table?
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Good morning, Mr. Sewell. Good
morning.
The issue I first like to point out is I'm not an activist. I'm nonpartisan. And being able to testify across this nation, four provinces, 2 territories, to be able to tell my opinion under oath, to talk and look at police action, police training, and the applications of it. And just so you know, so our viewers know, I've testified on both sides, for and against police action, right down the middle, about 50-50, 50% of the time. So not a hired gun, and probably a poor choice of words, but not a hired gun for that. I will tell you truthfully, and also talking about mental health, I have a fair bit of training experience with mental health professionals. Matter of fact, just last week, I provided a hands-on training for security staff at CAMH. And for those who are not familiar with that, it's the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, probably Canada's most revered mental health facility. Tomorrow morning, I have a Zoom conference talking about development of a training program out in Kingston, actually, with a major hospital. So I'm very well versed in training law enforcement personnel. Before I left policing, I was an instructor at the Ontario Police College, and that was around 2000 up to about 2001. I taught the men and women in this province to respond to emergent calls, 911 calls, to respond as a peace officer, to understand the relevance and the importance of de-escalation, how to talk to a person, how to talk them down, no smoke and mirrors, and to say things that the community would expect of you, to do it in a manner in such a way that the community would expect it of you. And I always look at a triage of considerations when Mr. Sewell references the evidence is clear. Well, through whose eyes? And I need to talk about what I consider a triage, a response. I believe any peace officer or police officer, not only in the city but in this province, needs to consider the ethics associated to their actions, the morals, and of course the legalities. And I believe every case requires its own merits. I don't opine on matters that I've read about in the press or somebody's told me. I give it a very, very comprehensive review. And then I'm able to undertake cross-examination and speak to a judge and or a jury or a coroner's inquest. And I work with a number of activist counsel as well. And will work on certain files that I believe are appropriate to speak on. When I don't agree with counsel, obviously in that position I can't. So today's debate, what I'd like to be able to point out is our viewers to be open-minded, to not be partisan, and to talk about some of the realities associated to training and de-escalation programs. And we'll talk about programs if time permits. We'll talk about the TIDES program that CAMH provides. We'll talk about a program called NVCI, Nonviolent Crisis Intervention. We'll talk about effective communications. In 1993, there was an author called George Thompson, and he released a book called Verbal Judo. How to talk angry people down, people that are afraid of you, people that are experiencing and living with the issues of social mental health, and to do it in a manner in such a way that everyone is okay and everyone goes home to the people they care about.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. An opportunity now for rebuttals. This is where I'm going to ask each participant to come back in 2 to 3 minutes or less with just some quick reactions from what they've heard from each other. So, John, give us your rebuttal here to Stephen's opening statement.
Well, my impression is that I think Stephen was talking about the idea of trying to train police officers to respond in more useful ways. The whole idea of nonviolent intervention and talking people down and so forth. But I think the problem is that police officers start by being trained to command and control. You go to police college, you look at what they're doing, you look at all the things that they're involved with and being trained, and it's command and control. You go to a situation, you say, lie down, put your hands up, whatever it happens to be. And that, in fact, is not an appropriate response in most cases. And that's why people say, oh, well, we better retrain police. My impression is that that's a real bad way of doing it. Let's get the people in, first off, who know how to deal with those situations, rather than being trained as a police officer to command and control and command, and then to say, oh, we're going to put up some other training on them. So getting civilians to actually do that kind of work, who know how to respond to those problems, is probably a much better way of dealing with it. And I mean, I think the point we have to realize is that racial discrimination is systemic in police forces across the country. The data is really, really clear about that. And trying to train them out of that, we've been talking about that for 20 or 30 years, it doesn't seem to have worked so far. We need a new approach.
Thank you, John. Okay, Stephen, similar opportunity for you just to come back on John's opening statement, what you heard from him off the top of the program, or the arguments that he's just made now.
Thank you. Mr. Sewell, you're probably aware that training as a base in this province starts at the Ontario Police College down by Elmer, Ontario, the other side of London.
Yeah, right.
Have you, sir, had the opportunity to view the curriculum, the course training standards, the lesson plans? Have you either actively participated or viewed the totality of the training, the 12-week or 13-week training program, to compare it to other agencies or other areas such as an FBI Academy in Quantico? Now, take a look at the amount of curriculum that is applied to empathy and de-escalation, rapport building, if you will, mediation, those components, and to actually see how officers are taken through it. And you should be aware as well that those programs, although used in a police training facility, are not created by police, for police. A number of clinicians, CAMH is involved in that process. There's a number of people who are medical professionals, and I say clinicians because ultimately they're the ones that would speak very, very well to escalation. But on that point with violence, recently looking at ministry statistics, Ministry of Labor, healthcare in our province represents roughly 13% of our workforce. And what's startling is that 50% of all injuries in this province is unfortunately experienced by people who are working in the healthcare industry. There is no magic elixir, sir. There's no magic pill. There's no magic wand in healthcare. Clinicians are under attack. I've worked on a couple of matters with Ontario Nursing Association, and we saw what happened just recently at South Lake Regional, which you're probably well versed in. Just training down at CAMH in Queen Street here. You realize the rigors and the horse associated to it. There's no magic pill. And if you're suggesting that civilians have the ability, it's not helping them in a healthcare setting. The amount of attacks on healthcare, actually assaults on healthcare staff, outnumber police and corrections combined. So we also have to be very, very aware that the alleged program or curriculum, or the paradigm, if you will, that's protecting clinicians is not protecting them. And when there's a 911 call or a person with a weapon, which I can speak to specifics in some cases, I dealt some high-profile cases, I find that people who have the loudest voice often know the least about the topic.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. So just a reminder to our viewing audience, we're debating defunding the police this morning. Our resolution is, be it resolved, the reallocation of funding from police to community services is a crucial step towards equality. Former Mayor John Sewell, author, thinker, is arguing in favor of the motion. Stephen, my counterpart here on the stage, 25-year veteran of the Toronto Police Services and an active consultant, security consultant, is arguing against the motion. So John, my opportunity now to join the debate, and let's pick up where Stephen left off and just have you answer this question that it might sound nice to have community workers going out and responding, as you point out, to the vast majority of calls where a physical assault or some acute act of violence has not occurred. But how are those people protected? To what extent is it reasonable for us as a society to put them in situations that we know can escalate quickly? And if they don't have either the training or the tools of a traditional police officer, are we asking them too much? Are we creating, in a sense, more risk as opposed to less?
Well, we could look at the example where, in fact, community services have been set up to respond to those in mental health crisis. Very interesting program that's been run in Oregon, in one city in Oregon, called the CAHOOTS program. It's been running for 12 years. It's a non-police response to people involved in mental crisis. They have been able to deal with all of those situations without recalling on the police. So that's 12 years experience. That's not too bad. My impression is that's pretty good. But I think the other point is that if a situation does escalate, then you call the police. But most of them don't. That's the interesting thing. And you go to something like the Gerstein Center in Toronto that now has a crisis response team. And I think that's exactly what they'll tell you. They can deal with most of those situations. And once they can't, they can phone the emergency task force to deal with it. But in fact, most situations can actually be resolved by people who know how to deal with them. Let's face it, there's a lot of workers in our society who deal with quite dangerous situations. A lot of children's aid workers, as an example, are often dealing with situations that are very dicey. And in fact, they manage to resolve them without the use of the police. And where they can't, they call in the police. But I think that this notion that, in fact, the police are the ones who can deal with all these situations, I think we've gotten way off track. And I mean, if I can just go back to the question of training. Yes, I'm aware of the Ontario Police College. I've been there. I've reviewed their curriculum. I've talked to people there. I'm aware of a curriculum of other police academies throughout Canada. They obviously aren't working. If they were working, we wouldn't have the systemic discrimination that's now evident throughout the country.
Thank you, John, because that's where I want to go next. John is leveling a charge here, Stephen, that it's bigger than, the challenge here is bigger than just a reallocation of tasks and functions, that within police services in Canada, there is systemic racism, there is inherent bias, and therefore, you know, it doesn't matter what the curriculum is. It doesn't matter how good the intentions of any one officer are. These fundamentally are social institutions that need root and branch reform. And in John's view, those that would like to see a reallocation of resources, a significant amount of funding pulled away from them, in part to acknowledge that, you know, we can create hopefully new structures that have less bias, that have less systemic racism towards communities and groups. So how do you respond to that charge of systemic racism?
Great question. I don't know, Mr. Sewell, if you've seen a CBC documentary called Hold Your Fire. And it reviews use of force training nationwide. And it starts with the incident a few years ago where 18-year-old Sammy Yatim got shot and killed in a streetcar in Toronto. It takes you to the United Kingdom, and it takes you to a few police agencies in the United States. I'm proud to say it was a part of the documentary. It showed me doing a segment at Michael Garron Hospital, formerly Toronto East General, dealing with sharp-edged weapons or encounters or violent behaviors, if you will. And I point that out because there's a couple of clinicians in that talk about hiring initiatives and how police officers or police recruits are hired, how they're obtained from the community. And I think it's safe to say, although I'm not involved in hiring initiatives with police services, is that there's a far greater representation of segments of our community. Every race, creed, color, orientation, language. When I joined policing and around the time Mr. Sewell was mayor, there was limited opportunities to speak languages. And right now, last I heard, Toronto Police can speak 200 different languages and cultures. And that's consistent with UN, United Nations requirements, if you will, saying that we're a multicultural society. But secondly, it's looking at the ability for police officers to display empathy. There's a great book published by, going to promote a Canadian author, here based on Mount Sinai Hospital, Dr. Brian Goldman. And he's released a Canadian bestseller called The Power of Kindness. And in it, he actually speaks about how Royal Ottawa Hospital can do testing on your empathy scale. And first responders, you know, sometimes there's allegations they could be sociopathic in terms of their responses. But having people's life skills, and we need to be behavioral interviewing right from the get-go, sir, when you start to hire people, find out the time in their life when they'd be able to manage resistance and be able to talk an angry person down. And I would demand references to ensure that indeed did take place. What was the last conflict you had in your life, and how was it resolved? You know, how do you deal with anger? So it's getting the right candidate and mixing the training program. and taking them through very, very meaningful and realistic scenarios where you can evaluate and judge a person's ability to meet the needs of the community. The community's changed. It certainly has changed. The demographics has changed. So I'm not going to deny there is allegations of systemic bias or racism throughout the country, but that has been tackled, as I see with police commissions, police services board, I should say, throughout the country, to start to recognize the need to hire all segments of our community to make it a representation of the community, just not a white Anglo-Saxon police officer, if you will.
So John, come back on that point. I mean, you were mayor of the city of Toronto, 1979, 1980. Very different police force and composition then. I'm sure you knew it well. Are you worried, John, that by promoting this message that the police services are systemically racist, you are in fact ensuring that those very same agencies are going to have a real challenge achieving the diversity within their ranks that would allow them to reflect the communities that they're serving, precisely because those communities begin to perceive the police services as some antagonistic, separate group, removed from their reality, removed from their diversity, infected with systemic racism? To what extent do we need to be careful about this type of language in terms of its larger effects on the problems we're trying to solve?
Well, I think you just have to ask the question, if you're Black or Indigenous, are you going to be friendly toward the police? Are you going to want to apply to be a police officer? Not too often. And I mean, it's not as though I'm making an allegation of systemic racism. In fact, the evidence is really, really clear. I'm just reflecting what everybody else is saying and what all the studies are saying. I mean, there's no question having a diverse police force is a very, very good idea, but I'm not sure it's going to solve very many problems. I think what we've got to do is start rethinking, what do we mean by policing? How do we ensure really good, safe communities? And in fact, I don't think we're getting that out of the existing police forces. And we've got to change the way we're doing it. And if we take functions away from the police, I think we're going to have less discrimination in our society, and we'll probably end up having a much safer society. So we've got to do that rethinking. And just try to say, we're going to train people, we're going to get different people, I don't think that's going to change anything.
Stephen, I mean, you were a 25-year veteran of the services here. I mean, wouldn't you, as an officer and a detective, have preferred to respond to the calls and the situations that most fully utilized your skills and abilities? And isn't John right that there is a lot of interaction between the police and the community that frankly could be facilitated by other groups, by mental health experts, by community workers, but instead, maybe unfairly to the police, we've burdened them with this idea that they need to be trained and they need to be responding to, 100,000 calls. What was it, John, in the first 4 months of this year? Why not be smarter and say, okay, we're a surgeon. We're going to pull a scalpel out to do this task. We're going to pull something else to do this. We're not going to ask this one agency to do everything. Why wouldn't that be something that your colleagues currently on the force today would say, hey, terrific, you're actually using my training in a much more meaningful way to me professionally?
I can't disagree with that. I think that would make reasonable sense, ethical sense. The ability to pass on some of those duties or responsibilities to other segments of the community. I am aware, and I recently read a report that as we speak, Toronto Police are looking to defer some of the response mechanisms to mental health challenges to a community crisis center. And they're even looking at to sustain that with funding coming from the Toronto Police. So Toronto Police in itself is supporting that. The mobile crisis intervention team, where you have a frontline police officer with a clinician with a health nurse, I would like to see that particular availability increase, more teams, more around the clock, just not Monday to Friday and weekends off. Issues and challenges, adversity takes place at all times. So we need that availability and to be able to provide that response more frequently than what we do. And I think that would somewhat mitigate and or prevent some of the challenges. And a law enforcement officer would be there in the presence of a clinician attempting to de-escalate, if things were to go awry, and then you'd be in a position to be able to assist and take reasonable steps to provide that, stand in front of that citizen, pull them out of the way, out of harm's way, and try to, I call it tag team, if you will, to try to de-escalate a situation without having to use avenues of force.
Stephen, that sounds good, but where's the budget saving? I mean, this is a debate about reallocation, okay? So we're saying, in effect, we're going to take money away from police services to fund these other things. We're not just going to find more money to fund these other things and keep funding the police services at the current model. What you just suggested seemed to be additive, not, you know, subtractive of the police services budget. So maybe you could give us your rationale for that.
Yeah, that's another good point. I understand the last numbers I was told, the operational police budget was in excess of $1 billion per year in Toronto. That's a major corporation's financial budget. Represents about 92 or 93% operational costs. Either where it's human resources that you're paying for, and the rest is technology. So we have a large city. It's difficult nowadays. Times are very difficult for a lot of peoples, and a budget needs to be under control to see where the best things are spent. But the resources to give the peace officer the appropriate training to respond to the right calls and to make certain other segments of our community they can also respond to them. There needs to be perhaps a breakdown of the services which are better suited for other agencies than police. I haven't seen a fruitful such assessment or analysis done of that yet. And the tipping point for that would be always, what if violence does occur? Who's accountable? And if you were to be a politician or a think tank or a senior officer and someone is to get hurt, are you putting yourself in that position of making that executive decision on a person's ability? If you feel fearful, whether it's valid or not, you have the right as a citizen to call 911 and expect appropriate police response there to protect. All people do. And if calls for service are getting to the point where you're unable to attend or there's a lengthy delay, so that could be human life. And I've seen the pain and the horror associated to perhaps a slower response than what it should be. So there's got to be a balance. There's got to be a blend. And I believe that violence or shootings in the city is up 10 or 15% this year. And this is in generally speaking, a lockdown environment. So we're opening up again slowly throughout the province. Things are changing. I'm afraid that if we defund the police and we don't give our men and women of this community, of this police service, the right tools and the means to it, we're going to see another challenge. Other situations go awry where calls for service and the demand is going to come back. So where's our place? We can't get enough.
So if you've joining us midway through this discussion, we are debating this morning the motion, be it resolved, reallocating funding from police to community services is a crucial step towards equality. Former Mayor, author John Sewell arguing in favor of the motion, former police services veteran and security consultant Stephen Somerville arguing against the motion. John, so I want to come to you on this budget point. We're going to leave some time for closing statements coming up, but I want you to respond to that, you know, there's a lot of expectation on the part of citizens in any city to have safe and peaceful streets, to have an environment where they and their families feel secure, and this all sounds good, reallocating funding from police services to community services, but Stephen's painting a picture here that there are increasing demands on policing. And if we engage in this type of reallocation, we have to be prepared for potentially some negative consequences in terms of the safety of the people providing those services. We've kind of already debated that, so let's put that on the side. But let's hear you a little bit more about the general sense of public safety and security in a city that would reallocate funding away from the police in a substantial way.
This is always the argument police make. If you take money away from us, society's going to fall apart. Things are going to get very, very dangerous. But I mean, let's be really clear. The number of police officers in Canada is about 70,000. The number of people arrested every year in Canada is about 700,000. In other words, each officer arrests 10 people a year, not quite one a month. In a city like Toronto, which is much safer than most other cities in Canada, police arrest about 2,700 people a year. And that's 4,800 officers who are doing it. So it means that each officer in Toronto is arresting about 6 people a year, one every 2 months. Well, I mean, this is not a lot. And to say that, in fact, we've got to have more police officers because, they're arresting one person every 2 months right now, and that's a problem. It seems to me that's wrong. All those other times that the police officer is working, those things could be handled by other people. So this idea that, in fact, by detasking police and getting some of their functions into other hands is going to result in a more dangerous society, I don't think there's any evidence for that.
Do you want to come back on that point, Stephen?
Yes, please, I do. Actually, I have to disagree with Mr. Sewell, and I'll tell you why, sir. No rhetoric here, but what you've not factored in to your comment is how many times police are able to put fires out by general patrols, routine discussions. I don't think it's an appropriate measure of police interaction just by looking at the amount of arrests that police officers make. I think that gives you an unfair snapshot of what police officers are doing. But general, even back in my policing career, I would respond a number of times to disturbances or challenges or fights, if you will. I didn't have to arrest people, sir, and bring them in. I created a rapport. I got to know their names. I was able to create an understanding and to create some recommendations so you get some counseling going for a family and whatnot. When you lose control of a situation, arrest might be an appropriate remedy, but it's not the only remedy the police officers have. And what's not factored in to your equation, sir, is the fact that a number of times police officers are out there representing people in crisis. People don't call you to their homes because they're having a great time. There's a challenge, things are going awry. And we need to recognize that we're also representatives of the community, and you're okay. And you need to recognize a lot of times police can manage issues without having to get you involved in the judicial system. And you build rapport with young people, old people, all race, all creed and colors to create that rapport. And it was so rewarding in my career how many times at the end of an incident, people look at me and say, thank you, and they shake my hand. And that was, to me, the real purpose. That's where I made a difference as a police officer. And just with respect, Mr. Sewell, you're not factoring that in, sir.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go to closing statements. This has been a fascinating conversation. What we've been trying to do is use a bit of the structure of debate to help our audience unpack these pro and con ideas on retasking, defunding. There's been different ways we've characterized it in this debate, but basically moving a lot of the budget and services that are currently covered off by police in our communities to more community service type groups, mental health experts, community workers. John Sewell, the former mayor of Toronto, arguing in favor of that type of transition. So John, I'm going to put a couple minutes on the clock here, just let you wrap up here. What are the key points that you want to leave our audience with when it comes to this conversation?
Well, one key point is that all the evidence shows in Canada that, in fact, police organizations are involved in systemic racism. Over and over again, if you're Black and you're Indigenous, your chances of being stopped, your chances of being charged, your chances of being subject to police violence are 4 to 5 times greater than if you're white. That's something we have to change. And the real question is, how do you change that? I don't believe that trying to say we're going to retrain police officers, I don't think that's going to do it. I think the better way of doing it, given the relatively small amount of time that police spend dealing with matters of violence and crime, is to ensure that most of the calls are in fact referred to people who can resolve them relatively straightforwardly because of the way that they've been trained. So that in fact, detasking police will be a serious benefit to society. It'll save a lot of money. It'll ensure there's less racism. And I think we'll probably end up getting much, much better results. But I just don't buy the idea that continuing to say, oh, police, just do it better and we'll be okay. I don't think it's going to get us anywhere. We've been talking that line for 20 or 30 years. We need some serious disruptive change.
Thank you, John Sewell, for that closing statement. So, Stephen Somerville, we're going to give you the last word in this debate, an opportunity to sum up your key points. What do you want to leave our audience with in terms of your analysis and insights on this question?
Thank you. I would just ask our audience, please, to be open-minded, to not take sides. And I want to share with you, if I may, a personal experience in our family's life. My youngest daughter is 22. and she has a young friend, a lady of color, and I say that for a reason, who has been battling mental health issues. And 3 or 4 times, to my knowledge, she's threatened suicide. And my daughter came to me, Dad, what do you think? And I said, you need to call the police, hon. You really do. And she did, and started with a health check. And police, on 3 occasions, were able to successfully deter actions that was going to lead to her personal harm, an overdose and literally running through traffic. And got her to KMH and made this lady very solid. I met her on the weekend, this young lady, and she gave me a big hug, and she said, your daughter saved my life. And I asked her, how was the interactions with the police? And she said they were very warm and very gracious. And those are the examples, sir, we also need to commit to recognize the system also works. It's very easy to jump on the negative issues that activists love to really lead their parade and lead their charge. But the amount of actions that do end peaceably, that do end without conflict and without injury, are we not factoring those into the equation when we want to intellectually determine whether this is working or not? I believe, Mr. Sewell, that change is created with a passion and an open heart and one handshake at a time. I disagree with you, sir. We need to have faith in the men and women that we're hiring, and the men and women are trying to do a good job. We need to give them the funding and the tools to get the job done right.
Wow, I want to thank Stephen Somerville and John Sewell for a terrific debate to kick off this Think 2030 series of debates and conversations that I'll be moderating over the next couple of days. Gentlemen, civilized, substantive, this is just what I hope for in terms of this conversation. You've all left us with new insights, and I hope all of us watching, while you might agree or disagree with Stephen or John, hopefully we've expanded our minds here a bit. We pushed ourselves to think in ways that maybe provoke more discussion, provoke some more reflection on this critical issue of community safety, policing, how we're going to build inclusive and representative and secure cities in the future. So I want to thank Randy Lennox, the whole team here, for putting these debates together, and we look forward to continuing the debate format here at Think 2030 tomorrow with a terrific debate on climate change. So stay tuned for that, and I'm now going to pass the program back to our hosts.